Now, conspiracy theories abound in South Africa around COVID-19 and, of course, the vaccine. This hobbles any public health messaging to educate and empower communities to make informed choices. It aids and abets stigma, fear and ignorance. To get into the psyche of South Africans on COVID, I'm joined by communications specialist Chris Vick, also the director of the Bekisisa Health Institute, Mia Malan. And last but not least, Annie Neo, a digital health specialist, will also join us shortly. Mia Malan, let me start with you. I mean, health messages often come across as quite wordy, quite complicated, with a lot of technical information. How have we been able to disseminate information about COVID-19 and particularly the vaccine that distills that information into clear messaging for South Africans? Or have we failed and, actually made them more susceptible to all these misinformation and conspiracy theories running around?
So, Karima, I think we've really just started with vaccine messaging. Previously, it was more general COVID messages. But I think there are certain rules that we haven't been following that well from the government's perspective. And there are some things that we have been doing okay. One of the things that we have been struggling with is communicating in time and being very transparent about our vaccine plans. So when you look at things that work and things that don't work with regards to communication during pandemics, one of the things that is really recommended is that all government leaders and high-profile government and political leaders should give the same message as far as it's possible. Obviously, different political parties are not going to give the same message all the time. And that is something that we've been struggling with in South Africa. For instance, when a High Court judge, for instance, says that a vaccine comes from the devil, or an ANC leader says a virus is transmitted by a 5G cell phone tower, that's not a consistent same message. And it's recommended that there must be a review process during pandemics as to what messages can go out and what not, and that it's important that public leaders understand that they have a responsibility, that even if they have different personal views, there is a responsibility to get the same message out. And it's also very important who is the person who communicates that message. For instance, a political leader is not always the best person to communicate a scientific message, particularly because not everyone has the same amount of trust in that political leader. It's so often determined by which political party you support. So a good example is, for instance, in New Zealand, the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern very rarely communicates scientific information. She always has a scientist who does that with her, because a scientist is not perceived as only more credible, but also as more objective and not aligned to a political party. And that is something that we can work on in South Africa, to be consistent with who communicate those messages. And it would also be very important when we move along the line that we make sure that the messages are in the language of specific communities. In South Africa, that would mean particularly in vernacular languages, in communities, and also to get community leaders who are trusted to communicate vaccine messages. But there's a good example in the United States, for instance, at Boston University. They had students who made up their own messages about, misinformation and vaccines, and it was often in information and in language that other adults wouldn't find acceptable. There was often swear words in it that they found more acceptable, but it proved to work very well.
Absolutely. Chris, you've been a communication specialist your whole life, and you have advised many government ministers. If you look at the challenges that we're facing here, you also work with a group of volunteers that put out information and facts that can be disseminated. What have we been doing right, and what can we do better?
Well, I think, Karima, the key thing to acknowledge is that we are all getting better at this. I think the first stages of the pandemic, there was a real sense of crisis and panic at what to do. I think government would acknowledge that it was a bit late to the party. A lot of effort went into communicating lockdowns, and the public health messaging sometimes got lost. It was also often only in English and only on platforms that urban areas are reaching urban people. But it's getting better, as I say. There's a lot better communication coming from the Department of Health. For example, GCIS is also distributing messaging around vaccines. COVID Comms, which you mentioned, the network that we set up, has now been brought into a structure that's coordinated by NEDLAC, which means that we should begin to see consistency in what government, business, labor, and civil society is saying. So a bit late, as Mia said, a bit too much in English, but the growth of material in plain language and in South African languages is increasing, and I think that is playing a major part in getting the messaging across. But I don't want to skip Mia's comment about trust.
Yes,
because I don't think government always realizes that the impact of its messaging depends on the public trust that it has.
Yes.
And if it flounders, for example, with the messaging around vaccine availability and vaccine rollout, that doesn't increase trust, it diminishes trust. And it's going to make it harder when the vaccines actually arrive and they start being distributed. I worry about the trust deficit that's started to develop. So if we can see, in terms of your question around doing better, if we can see more communication and engagement aimed at behavioral change, and which results in more transparency, and I'm hoping this NEDLAC structure will do that.
Yeah.
Because we mustn't forget, it's my last point, sorry, that communication is essentially being coordinated by the National Corona Command Council.
Yeah.
What gets communicated how. Now that, to be crude, is a group of soldiers and policemen and economists and health practitioners, etc. I don't know to what extent there's discussion around issues like public trust. So we need to see a much greater emphasis on that, particularly given the false information. I won't even call it false news. But we must also be blessed that we don't live in a country like Brazil, where the president says, if you take the vaccine, you'll turn into a crocodile, or if you're a woman, you'll grow a beard. At least we're not having to deal with that level of disinformation. But the fundamental is clear messaging in language that people understand, in languages that they use, in a way that builds trust and confidence in the system.
Absolutely. So with trust comes credibility, guys. And we have a credibility crisis in terms of government at many levels, particularly local government level. This is a year of elections. And there's already been efforts to try and politicize, the questions. But the fact that, there needs to be consistent messaging on the facts, consistent messaging on prevention, for example. Trust is a very intangible thing, Mia. How do you go about building trust when people are often let down by leaders? People are often, coming against a bureaucracy that is very unkind toward their everyday problems. What is it that we need to do differently that will get people to trust government? Because the idea of a police minister marching up and down and bullying people on a beach is not working. We've seen it over and over again. There has to be a different way in which we talk to people and with them in terms of the message, isn't there?
So, Karima, I think one of the things that particularly the civil society in South Africa can't understand why the government hasn't done it. And that is to be more transparent and consistent with announcing their plans about vaccines. And the reason why they can't understand it is because it's not like we don't have an infrastructure for that. During lockdown, the government was really good with communicating the announcements. And then the next day you would see 6 or 7, or the next week, 6 or 7 press conferences from different departments to explain how lockdown their regulations would work. And their argument is we need exactly the same for vaccines. So we need technical briefings, 2 or 3 a week to explain to people what's going to happen. So for instance, the vaccine plan that was announced late, it's not necessarily a bad plan, but it's something that they could have announced much earlier. It's something that they already started working on way before they announced it. And if we had announced it in time, there wouldn't have been so many questions or criticism about it. Rather, they would have been proactive communication about it. So I think part of building trust is transparency and to be consistent about transparency. And I hope that the lessons that what we did during lockdown in terms of at least announcing regulations and explaining what they mean, I hope we can take lessons from that and apply directly to vaccines.
All right, Mia, thank you so very much. Because of our technical challenges, we have to say goodbye to Mia and bring on our other guest, and she is a digital health specialist specialist, Annie Nail. Annie, I hope that you are with us, but to try and give my technical team a chance to get you up and running, let me go back to you, Chris. Chris, you come from, the days in which we had to do guerrilla media. We had to really be targeted in our messaging. If you look at the bunch of soldiers and bureaucrats and economists that are sitting in the command council, it's not people who necessarily understand that communication in many cases is an art, and that you need to do it in very specific ways. Have we tapped, the kinds of people that specific communities listen to, like your social influencers, for example, your role models? I mean, I don't see adverts with church leaders or religious leaders on talking about listening to, people and telling them this is how you can be a Xhosa man without breaking the regulations when you bury your father. This is how you can be a Muslim woman and pay homage to your grandmother without breaking the regulations. What do we need to do there, Chris?
Look, I think it is starting to happen. As I said, there are initiatives within NEDLAC and others. But, I mean, we're a fractured society and a very fragmented society. So how you get, even if it's one set of messages around vaccines, to roll out to different communities is very challenging. I would like to see more of what Julius Malema did this week, where he says very personally, I will take this vaccine and I'm not afraid to do it. I think there's a lot of space within the political community, also within business, community leaders, faith leaders, musicians with credibility who believe in science, not people like AKA. There's a lot of space for people there to do more than is being done. But I think we all have a personal responsibility as well. If we're on social media, if we're interacting with our families, if we're able to interact with friends, we are also personal ambassadors for this. So it's about taking personal responsibility alongside the sort of institutional responsibility that needs to be taken. But I do think, I think that GCIS as an entity, Government Communication Information System, is really starting to step up now. I know they were very active when the first group of South Africans came back from China. They have been doing some work around message development, around public health and around vaccines. So the gearing up is starting to happen. If you think about it, we've probably got till the middle or end of February before there's actually a vaccine available. And I think we must use that time to get rid of the non-science and to build an understanding what a virus is, how a vaccine works, that it has no significant side effects, and really sort of just drum that message through as many channels as possible, because there's no silver bullets. There's no one campaign that's going to make a fundamental impact and get behavioral change, which is what we really need. It does need all hands on deck.
Absolutely. And of course, this is a world in which technology and digital platforms is becoming increasingly, valuable and important. Annie, talk to us around what we can do digitally to get public health messaging more effective, more targeted. So, for example, should we just be doing TikTok videos, or should we actually be, buying bulk messaging? Can each church buy bulk messages and send SMSs out to their congregants about just debunking the myths, for example, about the vaccine?
Thanks. So you have mentioned one of the biggest problems with this space, which is as big and diverse as the people who interact with it. So in some cases, SMSs, bulk SMSs will work because it reaches people who have phones which cannot do WhatsApp. In other cases, you want it to be from a community leader, like a church leader, in order for that critical issue of trust that everyone has mentioned to be there. Frankly, what we need to do is we need to consistently be messaging on every platform that we have, which means that it has to be a community initiative. It can't just be a government top-down, because frankly, government will never have the money, government will never have the expertise, and government will never have the time, given that this is not usually their primary goal, is just to work on the information basis. So what we need to do is actually have a community-wide movement that looks at how we can consistently do this all the time in all the different ways, which means it's up to each of us. So each of us in every medium that we talk about. And if you think about it, trust is really about circles that you work in, the communication circles that you work in. So it's who's in your family WhatsApp group, who, when you get an SMS from, do you actually read and not delete? Which websites do you go to? So working at a community level means that each of us is then thinking about and engaging with what information we're getting, in what way, and then thinking about, is it something that we can trust or not? Which is always going to be a bit of a problem as well, because, you know, the WHO talks about we've got two pandemics. We've got COVID and we've got the information about COVID, the infodemic. And within that, it's everything from the false news to the misinformation, where people are getting the facts but not really understanding them correctly, to what we're saying is the hard science, where we can trust what's going on there. And we have to be able to address all of that. So it's a huge burden on the individuals as well as on the government, and most critically in the community and how we as a community address it.
Absolutely. So, for example, what I do every day, because I approach this pandemic as a war, I decide on 3 things that I want to do consciously to inform people who listen to me. So I'm a journalist. I'm regarded as a public figure. I post information on my Facebook wall from, reliable sites, as in, sites that are approved by, the World Health Organization, that sticks to the protocols and so on. And I also pass them on to my family. So I'm not waiting for the government to do that work for me. And a lot of people actually feel that they would trust me rather than, let's say, a government minister. Some people are also getting really anxious about all the bad news, Chris, on television. They just can't sit through a whole bulletin and be in, different message groups where family members are dying. How do we give information to people without making them more anxious, but still giving them the facts, where we don't sugarcoat our reality, but we don't scare people away?
It's a good question, Karima. I mean, I think it's a fine balance, right? Because you don't want to make the mental situation worse. You want people to be aware and not terrified. You want them to be buoyant in dealing with the pandemic and not depressed with the pandemic. But again, that's a personal choice. I mean, our view at COVID Comms is we make it available, and it's then your choice whether you take it or not. I mean, we use WhatsApp distribution groups, we have social media accounts, Twitter, Facebook, and our website. And it's a combination of pushing things down and enabling people to pull it down if they want it.
Yeah.
But it is difficult in a media society like ours. I mean, some people would say that the mass media is not paying enough attention to what's going on inside hospitals.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw footage at Steve Biko recently, but there's very little footage I saw something on Sky News, which I think the NCA reflighted, of the death in Italy. And those images of hospital wards are really chilling and compelling. So maybe we're not getting the right information. Maybe we're getting a lot of facts and figures. The personal stories might not be coming through. But it's a very difficult balancing act. And I don't think there's a recipe. It's about finding ways of empowering people without drowning them, and contributing to this sort of fatalism, which I think is part of the challenge we face at the moment.
Absolutely. Annie, how do we involve communities but still keep, like we like to call it in media rooms, an editorial check on the information, where the information remains accurate? Because as you devolve down to those communities, and as you become the leader that you want everyone to be, to initiate that change, your control over the quality and the factual basis of that information also becomes weaker. So it's a very, very, delicate balancing act that one has to do, isn't it?
It is. And frankly, it starts in that way. It starts with, do you have sources of truth that people trust?
Yeah.
So that would be, for example, your government website, something that you can always go back to, or your newspapers, that you know that the news media is also credible. And you can go back and say, well, has it been said there in a way that we can attribute to a source, and that source in itself has credibility, which isn't a huge issue. One of the questions with COVID is the whole way that people see and understand science, which is a much bigger sort of philosophical issue. But it's particularly problematic because we're talking about accelerations of science. We're talking about everything that ultimately comes back to people saying, well, what's the R value? And that's not something that people would have known what the hell it was, 10 months ago. So it's quite complex in terms of determining your source of truth. So you have to have somewhere where people know they can go. And then you have to make sure that community leaders, which will differ according to what your community is. It differs by your age, it differs by your area, it differs by your interests, that your community leaders themselves feel that they are able to talk about it, that they understand what they're being given. So what you're presenting also has to be understandable. Again, we're talking about interpreting science. which is in itself, as I said, a huge issue. And then you have to make sure that they feel that they should be doing this and that also they have the time to do this. So if you have people in the community who you know are trusted sources and who maybe you can give them some time, pay for their time to do it, like community healthcare workers, then that should be one of your focuses. You should be saying, we have this huge cadre of community healthcare workers. We can make sure that they have the information because they go to households and people ask them questions. Let's make sure that they have those sources of truth that they can talk to, refer to, and other people can go to.
Absolutely. Annie, thank you so very much. A huge task for the entire society. We all have to, of course, make sure that we deal with facts, that we dispel misinformation, and, of course, be each other's keepers. There you have it. Annie Nayo, a digital health specialist, also Chris Vick, a communication specialist, talking about the very complex way in which we need to approach communication that, in fact, engenders behavior change. Because without changing our behavior, we will not be able to beat this disease. Well, you've had your fix for the week. Join me again next Sunday. Thank you so much for watching.